The title of my talk is also going to be the title of a book I'm researching on the subject, Ancient Oaks in the English Landscape. I will present you with a bit of stunning statistics to begin with, as an opening score. And it's about the abundance of these oaks in England. There are probably more of those ancient oaks in England than in all other European countries combined. I talk about England deliberately, excluding Wales and Scotland, because they're not so numerous there, and it's more comparable to other European countries. So it's really England, and in England even it is lowland England rather than upland England. To quantify this is not all that easy, although I have figures, as you will see. But what is easier is to count the largest of these oaks. And I take the largest to be over 9 meters in circumference. And England has 115 now. We are still counting, but counting rather slowly. Maybe one in 2 years is added. The remainder of Europe has 97. And of course, we are counting there also. But it's not likely that it is going to exceed the number that exist in England. If we look not only at individual trees, and in my talk I will look a lot about groups of trees or the landscape in which they occur. England has about 30 locations with more than 50 large, ancient or veteran oaks. But other European countries have no such concentrations, or fewer than 5. The 2 countries that have a few of worth noting are Romania and Sweden. So, here is a map of England, and the current database, about which in a minute, has 3,312 recorded ancient and veteran oaks, large, from 6 meters circumference and larger. Now, this map is constructed by Justin Mote at Kew, our GIS man, and it is a so-called heat map, because to plot 3,000 dots on a map of this scale is an impossibility. So what you're looking at is the color green to red via yellow means an increase in numbers. So the red areas have large numbers of these oaks, but can only be shown with a few dots in where they actually occur. And it will be obvious that they are not evenly distributed. For a start, most of them seem to be in the southern half of England. And then looking there, you will see that the Welsh border counties, or the Welsh marches, as it is called, Gloucestershire, Herefordshire, and Shropshire, have many of them, and it moves east into Warwickshire. Then the other area that is rich in them is the home counties around London, and finally, but more scattered, East Anglia. But there are also, as you can see, areas which have very, very few of them. So there are reasons for this, and we will come to that. So why is it that England has so many of these ancient oaks? That is a question that has intrigued me for many, many years. I've lived in this country 23 years, coming from the Netherlands. I've worked at Kew for about 20 of those. I went to Richmond Park almost a week after I was appointed, and I saw all these oaks in Richmond Park, and I thought, wow, We've got nothing like that in the Netherlands at all. So why? Well, to answer that question, one needs data. And I can say I now have those data, and that's thanks to hundreds and hundreds of volunteer recorders, you could call it citizen science, that record ancient and veteran trees. There's a slight difference between ancient and veteran, but don't worry too much about that. They record these trees all over the country, and also in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. And that database I work with. So the Woodland Trust manages that database. I extract all the oaks out of it, the native oaks, and I have taken a cutoff point of 6 meters circumference. Smaller trees I do not analyze nationally. I analyze them in certain parts, in certain locations, because there are good reasons for that. But normally 6 meters is my cutoff point. I will come to the reason for that also. So what I have done with this database, 3,300 oaks, and that took a long time, I can plot all these oaks on the map. I can plot them on the current Ordnance Survey map, I can plot them on the 19th century Ordnance Survey map, and I can even, in some cases, plot them on older maps. I can also research, of course, what there was in that location more than 400 years ago. I take 400 years because on average, statistically, a 6 meter oak can be 400 years old. So we're talking about the Middle Ages, and we're talking about the Tudor period until Elizabeth I dies in 1603. Yes, of course, there were areas with oaks after, but I'm interested in that earlier history because that's the relevant period. And one of the first types of land use that come out are the royal forests. What's left of them, of course. This is a map of the middle or early part of the 14th century. By that time, the royal forest had already greatly reduced in size and also even in number. You see, when William of Normandy conquered this country, he declared royal forests. Forest law was to be applied there. And at some point, about a century later, it is thought that maybe a quarter of the whole country was royal forest. Now, we have to understand that the word forest now means trees, but in those days it didn't. It meant deer hunting. So a forest could be without trees. Exmoor, Dartmoor, the peaks, High Peak, you see it on the map, hardly any trees there, but it was a forest. But what is of interest is that these half-wild landscapes were preserved. The people were not allowed to cut trees. The vert, there was a prohibition to touch the venison, the deer, and the vert. The vert, V-E-R-T, it's the French word for green. It means the trees. So one reason why trees were preserved is the royal forests. None of these trees were planted. It is a common misunderstanding that people planted oak trees in the Middle Ages. They didn't. They're the natural trees that occurred. You can go way back to Anglo-Saxon times and even earlier. So there is, regeneration naturally, and it was these landscapes in which they occurred and were preserved. And now, what would a royal forest have looked like? I mean, I'm talking here about a royal forest that has trees. Well, this picture is taken in Richmond Park, and that is by no means a royal forest, but its landscape is rather similar. And we will come to this landscape time and again with the other land uses as well. By Oliver Rackham, it was called wood pasture or woodland pasture. I prefer to call it pasture woodland for reasons that is the better translation of the Latin silva pastilis, which is the term used in Domesday Book. Anyway, that's a detail. What you're looking at is not a closed forest, it is an open landscape with trees. And it is primitive, it is not manicured, it is wild or semi-wild. And in that landscape lived the deer, red deer originally. Fallow deer are imported by the Normans for parks, but the wild deer in the forest were the red deer, and of course roe deer, but they were small and not terribly interesting to hunt. So what has happened? Well, the first thing I discover when I research this is that little remains of those royal forests. And the fragments that do remain have much altered in many cases. What I'm specifically referring to here is plantation forestry. You know, forest came to mean trees, and we needed trees, and the Forestry Commission started planting conifers. The New Forest is now the largest of the remaining royal forests. But I have looked all over England at all, and this has been mapped, I don't need to do that. Other researchers at the University of Oxford have done that for me. I have looked at where exactly were all these royal forests over the centuries, and are there in those locations still ancient oaks? And if there are, I assign that oak to a royal forest. So in my database I have RF against a good number of trees. And so there were 44 royal forests remnants that I researched, and of course in many cases I've been out in the field there too, if it had to be. But it was a desktop study in other cases. But only 20 of the royal forest remains or remnants have still ancient oaks. Many, like indeed the New Forest or Savernake Forest, but others only 1 or 2. So in my database, the royal forest explain just 7.3% of the ancient oaks. An additional 4.6% I write there are associated with chases. What were chases? Well, the king, of course, had the prerogative of hunting deer in the royal forests. No one else could. But of course, the nobles were not terribly happy with that. Certainly because the Norman kings were, they introduced this strictly feudal system. So eventually, the big magnates were often allowed to have a section of the forest in which they could hunt. And among these magnates, we can count some bishops as well. The Bishop of Winchester, for instance, was a keen hunter in the Middle Ages. Now, these areas then were excluded from forest law, and the lord, who was given that right, could exercise his own rules, which for the commoners, for the people, meant pretty much the same thing. They still couldn't touch the trees, and they still couldn't touch the deer. So there are chases too, or remnants of chases, which I've researched, and these explain about 4.6% of my oaks. Let's have a look at some of these forest remnants. A famous one is Sherwood Forest. Now, Sherwood Forest today is a tiny little bit of what it once was. And much of what it once was already in the Middle Ages heathland rather than trees. But still, there are some areas, and the most important one is called Birklands in professional terms. For tourists, it's now called Sherwood Forest, but it's only a section of Sherwood Forest. It's where Robin Hood is supposed to have hung out But of course we all know that that's more a story. But if you go there, you come to a visitor center and it's all about Robin Hood. But Berklands is an interesting place, and here you can see a few of the ancient dodders, as they are sometimes called by people. They look as if they are dying, but they normally aren't. They're just old. And of course, it has the most famous ancient oak in the country, which is the major oak, called the major oak after a military man in the 18th century who apparently first measured it and drew it in a publication. I'll come to that later. And this is the major oak. It's by far the biggest one now left in that bit of Sherwood Forest, and it's propped up by metal poles, unfortunately, but they think they have to do that, otherwise it might collapse. Now here is the same tree, drawn in 1888. And the interesting thing is that this landscape that you can see, and there's deer there, there's still deer, but not too many. But what is striking is the openness of the landscape. And nowadays, if you go there, you walk through a wood before you get to the tree, but that is all secondary. So, you know, in a little over a century, it has grown to a wood again. But in the past, right from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, it was open. It was grazed. People in a royal forest, what they were allowed to do was to take their animals in there and graze them. Cows, of course, in the autumn, if there were acorns, they could send their pigs in for pannage, as it was called. Okay, another forest in Wiltshire, Savernake. Savernake is a marvelous area. It's quite big, but it is still also only a remnant of what it was in the Middle Ages, and it has a good number of ancient oaks. Savernake's history goes a long way back. It was already a hunting forest in Anglo-Saxon times, but then, as you know, the Normans grabbed everything from the Anglo-Saxon nobles and put their own nobles in charge, and so its custody was given to Richard Estermy, who fought with William at Hastings. So as a thank you, he gave him that forest. It is a privately owned forest, which is quite exceptional. Royal forests are nowadays 90% of what's remained is in the hands of the Forestry Commission, so it's government land. But in this case, it went for some reasons to the Earls of Cardigan, but they leased it to the Forestry Commission. Now, we'll come to that in the end of the talk, but I can already mention here that thanks to the Earls, who didn't want the Forestry Commission to plant it all over with conifers, the ancient trees, or a good number of the ancient trees, are still there. And of course now the Forestry Commission values them too. This landscape, this type of woodland, again, is what you would expect in the Middle Ages. Not necessarily every tree was big, but it was an open situation, and you had copses in them in many of them where people had coppicing woods, and temporarily they would put a fence around it to prevent the animals from eating it all up. And now, if you go there, you are more likely to see this. You see an ancient or veteran oak surrounded by conifer plantations. Or, like here on the left, one of the big oaks in Savernake stands right at the edge of a very busy road. Another forest remnant is Windsor. WindsorGreat Park was a deer park, but then adjacent to that, towards Ascot and beyond, was the Royal Forest of Windsor. And much of that was heathland, but some parts had still ancient oaks. So Windsor Forest is a typical creation of William the Conqueror. And again, here in later centuries, plantation started, first with oaks. It is said that Elizabeth I gave an order to Lord Burleigh to plant oaks in the, well, during her reign. I don't know exactly the date anymore, but in the latter half of the 16th century. But of course now plantation is conifers almost everywhere, with a few exceptions. So here we have a few of these trees in an area that's outside WindsorGreat Park and in the former forest. And it's interesting to look at these trees. When they are not too far from London, I've often visited them many times, so I can photograph them in different seasons, as you can see here. And it's a typical tree. It's an ancient pollard tree. Pollarding meant cutting above the reach of the animals. That's what the commoners were allowed to do. And then, of course, this is a lapsed pollard, so it has huge limbs and it's very ancient. But in royal forests, you see that often because the commoners had access. They couldn't touch the deer, and they couldn't cut the trees to remove them, but they could use the branches for fuel or other uses very often. Some of these trees are really ancient wrecks, but that doesn't mean that they are dead or nearly dead. As long as here they're this one is propped up by struts, and if you do not do that, then it may further collapse, but it is still alive. And this is in Cranbourne Chase or Park. It's an adjacent bit which at one time was a chase out of the forest, and it is one of the fantastic areas with ancient oaks. And this kind of landscape, you have to imagine, they are now grazing it with longhorn cattle again, but this type of landscape you would envisage in the Middle Ages as well. Here is a view in the winter. This is an over 9 meter circumference oak. So those were the royal forests. Next, and of even greater importance, are the medieval deer parks. This map shows 1900 medieval deer parks in England, all mapped by Leonard Cantor in 1983. He published a gazetteer. It's a rare publication, but I've got a copy. And you can see all the dots are the deer parks. They're not necessarily present at any one time, but they are present between William the Conqueror's reign, say around 1000, well, Domesday Book, say 1086, in which there were only around 40 parks, and then a century later there might have been as many as 1500, and then in total, Rackham and others came to the idea that there might have been as many as 3,000 deer parks during the whole period between 1066, the conquest, and 1485, when the Tudor reign starts. So what I can do, of course, and have done, is to overlay this map with the distribution of the oaks. That already gives an interesting pattern. But, of course, I have researched this in more detail. basically park for park, because I know where all these parks were, and often you can recognize them on the map still. Now, after the Norman conquest, it became a craze, as we now would call it. Every nobleman wanted at least one park, and some had many. And I'll quote you here. "Whilst you have disparked my parks and felled my forest woods, leaving me no sign, save men's opinions and my living blood to show the world I am a gentleman." This laments Henry Bolingbroke in Shakespeare's Richard II. So, a gentleman had a park. If you didn't have a park, you weren't a gentleman. And of course, it is the same story as with the royal forests. The parks had to have trees to feed and shelter the deer, and these trees were already there. In other words, the Lord would look at an area in his manor where there was no arable land, there was no hay fields, it was wild or half wild, and there were trees, and that's where he would make his park. So medieval deer parks explain 34.6% of the 3,300 large ancient oaks. And then I have distinguished a Tudor deer park as being a park that was established after 1485, after Henry VII became king, and up to the end of Elizabeth's reign. Now, this is also because there was a revival of deer parks. When I plot all the dates of the deer parks as they were when they were first mentioned in the records, it goes up in the Middle Ages, and then at the Black Death, it drops, because there was no labor anymore to make them. Making a park pale was a labor-intensive and expensive affair. And then slowly they creep up again, and then in the Tudor period there is a revival. And many new parks were established, often larger than the Middle Ages, than the medieval ones were. Now this was the deer that was in the parks, imported from southern Italy by the Normans, fallow deer, dama, and they were excellent for parks. The red deer were not good for parks unless your park was very big. I won't go into the habits of red deer, but you have them in Richmond Park, but not in a small park. And most of these medieval deer parks were not very big. So this was the deer that they put in there. Deer parks were surrounded by a park pale, or sometimes a stone wall. A park pale was a ditch on the inside. The earth out of the ditch went outside as a bank, and on top of the bank they would place oak slats. And they would make them, some of them have actually been reconstructed in some parks for a short distance. They would make them unequal in length, and a deer is afraid of that. So if it sees these uneven slats standing up, it won't jump. And of course, if it wants to jump, it goes into a ditch first. But smartly, from the outside, the jumping is easier. And so his lordship could steal deer from the forest that jumped in and never jumped out. I can recognize these parks. Well, I know Cantor has mapped them, but only roughly county by county. I go to the detailed maps and Google Earth and so on, and I can find where they were, because there was often a lodge or a moated house in the park, usually in a corner. You can see the outline. I'll show that in a minute. And even if the park has gone, traces can often be recognized from the air. So this medieval picture in a manuscript is a bit idealistic. There's all sorts of animals in there that are unlikely to have been there, but certainly there were deer. Now here is a beautiful example of the remains of a medieval park pale. I am standing in the park here. This is Woodland Park, or Shoot in Devon, in the south of Devon. I'm standing in the park. The ditch is on my side, the wall, the earth bank outside. Of course, there are trees growing on it now, but there would be a pale of oak slats and oak poles on top of it. So, very briefly, this is the way I researched this. This is a map, an Ordnance Survey map, and I can plot the green symbols and the red symbols are the trees. The green and red simply means that green is public access and red is on private land. But I can hover my mouse over each tree and see what it is and how big it is and so on. And then I have my database, of course, to compare. And in this way, I have done it. You can see on the where's the, oh here. You can see the word park pale here. Well, that on that side here is WindsorGreat Park. So the park pale goes here, then stops, then there's a bit going here. So, and I have been able to trace that pretty much around WindsorGreat Park. So in the Middle Ages, within that park pale, that's where the park was, the deer park was. And if my trees occur inside that, I assign them to a medieval deer park, MDP. If not, they are either in the forest or in the chase. So that's how it works. It's quite a job, but I've only, of the 3,300 oaks, only about 460 are still unexplained. So I can do something with that data set. Now here is an interesting one. Staverton Park is one of the famous ancient oak sites in Suffolk, almost right on the coast. And you can easily see the park outline here. Even though there's arable, conifer plantations, the bit in the middle, this is the most important area for the oaks. And there's the thicks here, this area, which is full of big hollies as well, and is much denser, but that is probably a development since the 18th century. This is more like the Middle Ages. And here, these fields is a privately owned land here and park. The person who owns this is farming there, a bit unfortunately, certainly because he is raising pigs there now, which are not very good for, the pollution issue. But this is this is an ideal. Of course, many of them are more difficult. But here I can clearly see the outline of 3/4 of the park. So I have, for 12 counties where there were many medieval deer parks, I have done a detailed assessment of what has become of them. I don't want you to go through this table in too much detail, but a few things to take home is only 3 parks in total in those 12 counties are still in a medieval state, including deer, including the large ancient oaks. 75% of all the 769 parks have gone without a trace. It's agriculture, it is urbanized, whatever. But there are also quite a number, 113, landscape parks with ancient oaks. There are 57 of these deer parks are now landscaped, Capability Brown and their ilk, and they still have ancient oaks. So you can see this. Over the centuries, there's been quite a bit of destruction, but more importantly for our purposes is that there are quite a few left with ancient oaks. So a few examples. Maca Spark in Herefordshire is a wonderful site. It's an SSSI, of course, because of the ancient trees and the biodiversity that goes with that. It's also privately owned. And it is a good example. It is one, well, Herefordshire was outside my table, but it is one of the examples. I think there are about 6 or 7 in total in the country, which I would still call a medieval deer park with the medieval landscape and the medieval trees and the deer. Staverton, we've already mentioned it, is one of those in Suffolk. And in Staverton, almost all the ancient oaks are pollards. Oliver Rackham believed that that was the norm, but I now know nationwide it wasn't the norm at all. It's actually the exception. Deer parks had far fewer pollards than Royal Forest, chases, and we come to another category, commons, in a minute. So, but he's right. In East Anglia, there's a predominance of pollards. If you go to the Midlands, the West Country, or the South, it's the other way around. Probably because the landowners didn't give access to the commoners in their parks. Here's a winter scene of WindsorGreat Park. WindsorGreat Park, of course, is huge. It was already very big. Together with Woodstock Park, now Blenheim in Oxfordshire, these are the two still extant parks that were by far the largest. I come to Richmond Park in a sec. It's another story. Here you have an idea. Again, in Windsor, they are keeping large herds of deer, as you know, and parts of it, this area is called Bears Rails, is wooded and has ancient oaks, and the deer are living there as they were in the Middle Ages. And some of these trees are quite impressive. This one is in Windsor. It's called the Signing Oak. It's in Windsor Park. But my most favorite place is High Park in Blenheim. High Park is a part of Blenheim Park. You all know where Blenheim Palace is, of course, near Woodstock in Oxfordshire, the Duke of Marlborough. But High Park has been left. Capability Brown didn't touch it. Hooray! You can feel that I'm not too much of a fan of Capability Brown, but I should be very quiet because it is his anniversary this year. Anyway, High Park is beyond the lake. It's quite a walk from the entrance to the park, and it's primitive, and it has a fantastic number of ancient oaks. More big ancient oaks than anywhere else in the country. I counted 4 oaks here over 9 meters circumference. There's no other site in England that has as many in a very limited area. Here is one of them. And its management is sympathetic, although the Duke doesn't want grazing, which is a bit unfortunate, but there are deer, but there's not a deer herd that is kept. It's just wild running fallow deer. Now, we come to Richmond Park. What is Richmond Park? Richmond Park is very near here. And when I was taken aback by it in historical terms for a long time, until I went to the Library of Richmond and people helped me digging into the archives and digging up some old documentation. And then I realized, oh, this is not a medieval deer park at all. It was emparked by Charles I. In 1637, the wall was completed, but the ancient oaks are much older. So what was there? Well, in short, it was common. There were commons. There were 6 parishes, and each of these parishes, from Kingston right through to Roehampton, they used that land as commons. And I found an old map made just at the time then when the wall was completed, but the landscape hadn't changed yet, and that taught me what there was there. But it is a fantastic place for oaks, and of course its management now tries to balance a lot of things: tourism, people, dogs, ancient oaks, deer, you name it. Some parks had not a park pale, but a stone wall, a dry stone wall. This, of course, was easier to build, cheaper, and especially it would last longer, because the wooden slats had to be renewed all the time. So this is Bradwell Park in Leicestershire, and here you can see what the reason is. There's rock outcrops there that enabled the owners. This is a famous place because it was owned in later centuries by the Grey family. Jane Grey, how many days was it? 9 days queen was born there. The house is a ruin, but it's that park. So, are there other land uses that are relevant? Well, there is one. It's wooded commons. These are the rarest. The commoners had certain rights in certain areas, uncultivated lands on which they could use the land more intensively in a way than they could in royal forest, and certainly in parks where the lord would often exclude them altogether. But that also has meant, of course, that the trees often didn't last very long. Many of the commons that I've researched via the map are now just, well, they are full of trees, but they don't count. It's plantation or secondary growth. The ancient trees are very rare on commons, but one of the best ones not far from here is Ashted Common in Surrey. And on commons you almost invariably see that the ancient oaks are pollards, now lapsed pollards, but they were used in that way. And they explain 6.5% of my ancient oaks, so not very many. I have very briefly to say that ancient woodland, as Rackham and others have written a lot about, are nothing to do with this. An ancient woodland was formerly a coppice wood, and the trees in coppice wood, the standard oaks, were not allowed to grow old at all. This is a good example of a restoration of a coppice woodland. It's in Hatfield Forest, and this is about the size that the tree would be allowed to grow, maybe a bit bigger, and then it would be cut. So there's no point in going to ancient woodlands searching for ancient oaks. That these two don't match. Sometimes there are coppice. Oak coppicing was not common in lowland England. It's much more common in Scotland and Wales, but it wasn't common in England. But where it occurred, you can sometimes find large coppice stools. But I have excluded these from the database because they are not truly ancient trees. It's a bit difficult, this bit, but I didn't want to muddy the waters. Now here is the difference. So a coppice is cut near the ground. That means, of course, that you have to fence off the area, otherwise the animals will eat it. But a pollard was cut up there, and so the animals couldn't reach it. And that is the thing that was happening on commons. And you can see that this pollarding of trees has lapsed for a long time. Most historians believe that it really sort of ended by the early 1800s, so almost 200 years ago. So these big limbs on these trees can be as old as 200 years, and they are very heavy, and this can cause a problem because eventually the bolling, the trunk is hollow, it may break them apart. Sometimes there's very little left of a common with trees. This Dunstall Common, I searched for a long time in this area, driving my car left, right and center. Finally I found it, and it's no more, it's a bit of grass as large as a small village green, and there's this one ancient tree on it. And it's, of course, there's no village, so it stands in the middle of agricultural land now. It was all cultivated, and only this little bit was left alone. Now, finally, if there was no deer park, no royal forest, etc., I still had a large number of oaks that I needed to explain. And